Just posted a new article on my blog over on Steemit. It's regarding the opioid crisis and how this ties in to the deep state, as well as a mysterious death. This goes back a few decades of journalist Gary Webb. I'm sure many people have heard of the death, about the mysterious death of Gary Webb. I think it's worth taking another look at, given this current opioid crisis. So this is the article that I posted. I'll just read from it. It says, "Big Pharma's death blow to America's working class, the opioid crisis, the deep state, and the mysterious death of Gary Webb." The article begins, "It's no secret America's working and middle class families have been under assault for decades. Stagnant wages, dwindling opportunities, you have skyrocketing costs in both housing and living expenses. These factors have been slowly draining the life out of millions of American families for many years. Then to add to this problem, really after the election of Barack Obama, we saw a dramatic increase in the amount of deaths related to opioid use. The emergence of a full-blown crisis has further devastated countless communities across America." I have a chart here. You can see really in the leading up to the second term, Barack Obama's second term, you have a pretty dramatic spike in all overdose deaths involving opioids. Now, it's a very recent report. There was one report just from today from the Daily Caller talking about how big pharma companies are facing a record number of lawsuits for their part in sparking the epidemic. This Daily Caller report from today, they mentioned that as of 2016, opioid overdose made up a staggering 66% of all drug overdose deaths. This surpasses the annual number of lives lost to breast cancer. They go on to report that there are now over 75 cities and states mounting lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies for helping spark the crisis through, quote, knowingly false advertising. They had linked to a article from Oshkosh Northwestern, which points out one of these most recent lawsuits sparked from officials in Winnebago County in Wisconsin. They joined 11 other counties in this most recent massive lawsuit against big pharma companies, claiming that drug makers, quote, flooded patients with dangerous prescription opioids, while fully aware that, quote, their opioid products were addictive, subject to abuse, and not safe for long-term use. In some ways, I point out in my blog, I find that this current crisis can be compared, at least in some ways, to the emergence of the crack cocaine epidemic in the 1980s and 1990s. Seems like there are different demographics that were targeted in both of these epidemics. Now, relating to the crack cocaine crisis, several theories have claimed that the CIA intentionally ignited the crack cocaine epidemic back in the 1980s as a means to generate revenue for secret operations, with others believing that it goes even further, that their goal was to intentionally target and break down African-American families. This crisis largely, at the time, targeted African-American communities. You also have the death of journalist Gary Webb. He wrote about the CIA's intentional flooding of crack cocaine into African-American communities in 1996. Wrote about this. I added a quote from an article from the Telegraph. They basically just summarized the findings by Gary Webb in his book, Dark Alliance. This was the quote. It reads, "It is one of the most bizarre alliances in modern history. The union of a US-backed army attempting to overthrow a revolutionary socialist government and the Uzi-toting gangstas of Compton and South Central Los Angeles. Perhaps most damningly, Webb wrote that the crack was virtually unobtainable in the city's black neighborhoods before members of the CIA's army began supplying it at rock-bottom prices in the 80s. For the better part of a decade," he wrote in the intro to the first piece in his trilogy, he says a San Francisco Bay Area drug ring sold tons of cocaine to the Crips and Blood street gangs of Los Angeles. They also funneled millions in drug profits to a Latin American guerrilla army run by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. He also wrote about the cocaine trafficking trial of a former Contra leader who testified that the CIA agent who had commanded the guerrilla army told him, quote, the ends justify the means, and that they sold almost a ton of cocaine in 1981 alone, the profits of which were going to the Contra revolution. Then, after publishing this damning evidence against the CIA, Webb had died in mysterious circumstances. Quote, Webb was found dead in his Carmichael home on December 10th, 2004, with 2 gunshot wounds to the head. His death was unbelievably ruled a suicide by Sacramento County, the Sacramento County Coroner's Office. He was found with 2 gunshots to the head. It was ruled a suicide. Many people at the time did not buy that story. Seemed like it could have been related to him calling out the CIA for their role in the crack cocaine epidemic. So seems to be some similarities to that with what we have going on now with the opioid crisis. Of course, there have been several whistleblowers that have alleged that the CIA has pushed conflict in the Middle East as a means of securing resources for the productions of opiates, which are then transported to the West. In his book, Rogue State, you have former State Department employee William Blum. He called out the CIA for their role in the cultivation and transportation of opium around the world. This was the quote from his book, where he says the CIA flew drugs all over Southeast Asia to sites where the opium was processed into heroin and to transshipment points en route to Western customers. So this leads me to ask, is the opioid crisis this decade's version of the same nefarious deep state tactics which tore apart African American communities, now being aimed primarily at white working class families? Not just white working class families affected by the opioid crisis, but it seems like as compared to the crack cocaine epidemic, at least they are targeting different demographics and communities than we saw in the 1980s and 1990s. Same tactic, it seems to largely be targeting a different demographic, however. Now, under this current administration, back in October, President Trump called the opioid epidemic a, quote, public health emergency. However, I'm sure we've all heard about what Jeff Sessions is doing in regards to cracking down on marijuana use. I'm sure most people would consider that relatively harmless as compared to these big pharma companies, which continue to push much more dangerous opioids to the public. Why are they not being punished for this? As drug overdoses have now become the biggest killer of Americans under 50, one could ask, is the opioid crisis just the result of corporate greed? This is what the few mainstream media reports that do talk about this at all. They say it's simply a result of greed. Or could this go even further and be part of an intentional death blow against the struggling working class of America? Let me know what you think about this. I will follow up. I would do a follow-up video on Gary Webb if people are interested in going a little bit more in depth to his death. Again, it is some years ago, but it is interesting to recall and compare his findings with some of the things going on right now with this opium epidemic across America. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you could leave a like on this video, it's greatly appreciated, and subscribe to the channel. Also, I am on this website, Steemit. You can follow me there for more updates. I have a link to that in the description of this video, as well as links to all of the articles that I discussed. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment. I'll follow up shortly. Thanks again.